Pierre Bourdieu, who I will refer to as Pierre because saying his last name is super difficult, is a neo-Marxist, postmodern, or post-structuralist, conflict theorist, and innovator in sociology. Often wrote on capitalism's despotic nature. But was any of his criticisms even helpful? Does he bring a new vision in seeing the world? If you want to find out, then stick around, because I'm the Economancer, the high priest of the Economicon. It is my pleasure to share with you the sacred text of the Economicon. Today, I will conjure my economancy and explain some of his central ideas and give my thoughts. By the end of this, I hope you come away with a better understanding of Pierre. So let's start with a quote. Systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an expressed mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them. Objectively regulated and regular without being in any way the product of obedience to rules, they can be collectively orchestrated without being the product of the organizing action of a conductor. I promise you that was as hard to say as it was to listen to and just as difficult to read. Um, so, this guy Pierre was a structuralist studying linguistics and philosophy, which later morphed into, his work in sociology, much like, Sartre, Foucault, and Derrida. He comes from the same school. So, Pierre was best known for his book Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. This book looks at judgment, choices, and preferences people have regarding their relative social status and position in society. Pierre's prominent theories are cultural capital, field theory of sociology, habitus, and symbolic violence. The symbolic capital, which some forms of a language bring to their speakers while others form do not. The symbolic power and violence through which social norms of acceptable language are reproduced, sometimes with complicity of the speakers who are led to conform, and the habitus, which embodies the tension between individual agency and the social forces and occupies a position in a field with other habitus, each defined by their difference from the others. So let's further explain some of this. Let's start with symbolic violence because I'm sure that's going to be the most controversial. So this is the theory of how non-physical violence manifests itself in the stratification in society. Much like I was just talking about, that it is through the social norms of acceptable language and how they're reproduced. So we've kind of defined with rhetoric and contradictions non-physical violence. That's a contradiction, but how does it work and what does it look like? Symbolic violence works by saying that power requires justification and belief, and that Pierre believes that hard power is not a sufficient step in exercising authority. So basically, all forms of communication express symbolic violence, like body language and hygiene, which I'm assuming he come to that conclusion because he was furious at being called a stinky Frenchman. Um, an example of symbolic violence would be hit like a girl. This normative phrase, although there's an anatomical ergonomic difference between male and female swings as a function of bone structure, whatever, creates the idea that women should be subordinate to men in the linguistics used to describe the object and subject barrier. Another example is the normalization of a particular language usage. This can be like Scots-Irish English in the South and how that has been used to systemically discriminate against Southerners. It's also been a part of the linguistic analysis of African American language and that subculture. And whether or not society wants to normalize it or allow it is kind of the point that he's getting at. So I'm sure you're confused, just as confused as I am about how this is violence. So essentially what is proposed is the witnessing this degrading representation of oneself is meant to destroy or injure the recognition of mutual personhood, meaning that this dehumanizing factor removes you as the person from needing to empathize, or you can just straight out throw them out of your moral realm and judge them outright as all of their actions are going to be immoral. This leads to ultimately justifying armed and structural violence. Quote, I even think that one of the obstacles to progress of research is the classificatory mode of functioning of academic and political thought, which often hamstrings intellectual inventiveness by making it impossible to surpass false antinomies and false divisions. The logic of the classificatory label is very exactly that of racism, which stigmatizes its victims by imprisoning them in a negative essence. So the next thing we're going to look at is cultural capital. Obviously, when you start saying capital, you're swinging in the same vein as Karl Marx. And like I said, he was a neo-Marxist. Karl Marx had a profound impact on his work. So Pierre saw that capital is concentrated in the hands of a few, but he's not talking specifically about physical capital, because how we constitute capital in this world can be a function of the culture. So capital in the cultural sense are assets that you possess that help you climb up the social status hierarchies. So there are various kinds of knowledge, skills, and behaviors by being a part of a specific social group, which is the essence of social mobility or social immobility. He points to three types of cultural capital. This is embodied, institutional, and objectified capital. Embodied capital comes from socialization and education. This constitutes our mannerisms, syntax, semiotics, and skills. Next is institutional, which is essentially measured outcome like degrees and job titles, and how that presupposes, or I shouldn't say predisposes, an individual to how they're supposed to be viewed by society. And the last is objectified. And this is basically a rebranding of Veblen's pecuniary emulation that we had talked about. And so what he's saying is somehow consumption is predicated on the material, and you're consuming in your goal to be popular, and that you're using these status symbols to show who you are and how important you are, and that if you can show how important you are, then you'll necessarily move up in some social status and hierarchy. Now, he says about cultural capitalism, it necessitates a scholastic bias. What does he mean by this is that, let's say you have high culture and low culture, and if you're a student at school and you're not familiar with the preferred high culture, then you're not going to get the same advantages as a student who is familiar with high culture. So we speak this inequality in society into function as culture around upbringing and parental dispositions. So the next is field theory, which is not to be confused with the field theory like electromagnetic fields from Maxwell. However, it does try to pull from it. So individuals construct social fields and are affected by said fields. So you're an electron and you have a position in your field, which is a function of the three different types of capital: economic, social, and cultural. So individuals are affected by the field that they exist in, and each field has different rules. And so your capital becomes, or your levels of capital, depending on which one you're using, is a medium of exchange from within and between the fields. But the capital that's being exchanged from within and in between fields can be different. And since these fields are fundamentally competitive structures, they tend towards destructive equilibriums. Now, methodologically, field theory tries to bring in postmodernism into functionalism, and you can actually remove the deconstructionist bent from it and get a decent structural functionalist model. Also, he pointed heavily towards the consistent downward biasing of prices from competition as a bad thing, which blows a lot of people's minds, but we'll get away from that for now. So that was one of the most significant reasons that capitalism needed government involvement, was this downward biasing pressure of prices. And so then we go into the habitus. That's the habits that you form and the subjective system of expectations and predispositions that develop over time from how you're being inculcated by society as well as your parents and all of these things. It's not a social determinism, which a lot of people assume that it is, that it's social determinism. What he's saying is you're falling into this structure, and unless you can deconstruct yourself from that structure and those habits, then you are going to be predisposed and determined onto what you do in life. Now, here's some things. Pierre was highly critical of economics and wrote quite often in post-colonial terms. And if you're unfamiliar with post-colonial, it's essentially moral relativism when with regards to different types of culture, and that colonialism from Europe had these lasting negative effects on other cultures by like squashing their indigenous and native cultures and stuff like that. And he got this because he was in the war for Algeria and stuff like that, and he ended up doing work after the fact in that area, and it was profoundly important to him because he's seen how colonialism impacted the people there. Further, he felt that America's love of like social insecurity and individualism created a severe problem for the underclass. So, like, what does that even mean? Well, in his mind, he thought that because America focused so heavily on economic growth and technological growth, that it left behind the poorest in favor of following this growth. And this is commonly referred to as an unbalanced growth path, and he was highly critical of it. He was also tremendously critical of Americans not having a heavy influence from class consciousness. Much as I had said previously when looking into Veblen and Weber's work, America did not necessarily have holdovers from prior generations of class. So you didn't have to deal with like feudalism. And so that level of capital difference that was going on, that was kind of a function of somewhat of agrarian societies and somewhat of the, industrialization of America. So he concluded that this like individualistic presupposition fueled America's need for growth, but caused it to not care about the poor. However, I don't think this was anywhere near an original criticism of America's supposed classless society. Like I said, other people had brought this up. This is commonly referred to as the problem of class in America. So what can we derive from his work? In my opinion, not a whole lot. It seems he like repackaged and reasserted many of the old Frankfurt School beliefs, and he pulled a lot of it from philosophy and integrated it more into sociology. He attempts to make the Frankfurt School criticisms of capitalism and modern society into a science. To his credit, I think he did a good enough job fundamentally being a deconstructionist. But when you have one foot in science and the other in this post-structuralist rejection of science, this leads to a lot of his writings being paradoxical and, for the most part, gibberish, as the first quote that I gave you. Pierre really wanted to push sociology as an activist science, and this is something that we're seeing now in a lot of the grievance work and stuff like that. It's how can you make this science or this philosophy into something that's an activist representation. And at the same time, he criticized intellectuals for using their power and privilege in the public sphere by associating their scientific endeavors with public sentiment, as well as speaking on, subjects that they don't know anything about. So this is another contradiction in the work and the mind of Pierre. However, a point to be brought up is many apologists in the field of linguistics and sociology consistently try to hold him up in high belief, because they say a lot of people misconstrue the results of Pierre in favor of their own political beliefs. I mean, for example, there are some structuralists that consider Pierre's work in linguistics to be structuralist rather than post-structuralist, and many of the embattled debates over his Marxist beliefs and his views on materialism and history from a dialectical perspective. So ultimately, this man was a paradox. He wanted to invite science into sociology. He wanted to invite a lot of the new endeavors. He was actually really fundamental in what's called correspondence analysis and the geometric evaluations of data and stuff like that. He was really big into that. This ultimately we started moving towards like principal, component, and factor analysis, but This is an essential version of that correspondence analysis. And some people have pointed out that the reason why you shouldn't use correspondence analysis is because it's specifically designed to facilitate whatever your reasoning is. So if you have motivated reasoning, you will use that motivated reasoning within your model and come to a conclusion that may not be empirically true. And so this is one of the reasons why correspondence analysis hasn't jumped off in comparison to stuff like principal, component, and factor analysis. Um, so ultimately, I disagree with a lot of the work that he's done. And the reason why I brought him up and not the Frankfurt School is because he does model things more in a scientific way. And he really did try to move into science. Like the field theory, like I said, it's actually a fantastic idea. If you remove the deconstructionists and some of the wild presuppositions that's in it. In essence, it is a great way. You can implement it with network analysis and other forms of analysis, and you can come to plenty of structural functionalist models of social behavior as well. You can apply it to things in the field of economics, and it can be validated econometrically. It's not much different than the ABM models, which are really fun. So ultimately, the biggest criticism for him is, one, it's not a whole lot of original stuff. Two, his political beliefs got in the way quite often with his overall analyses of the structure of society. He wanted to be a structuralist, but he kept having problems trying to validate his leftist beliefs with his need for structure in the society. And he was also fundamentally a post-structuralist and a deconstructionist. His later writings really took off into, one, post-colonialism, and two, into gender studies. I mean, he was highly relevant or is highly relevant in gender studies now. He thought the biggest paradigm shift of society essentially comes from the male to female barrier. And he thought that was where we needed to land. Many have later criticized him for not caring enough about the structures of society with regards to race and other levels of intersection, because as he was writing this, we had already had the bell hooks revolution, as well as Kimberly Crenshaw. So we've already established intersectionality in American sociology. And so it felt like he was lagging behind, despite the fact that a lot of his work in linguistics and symbolic violence is now heavily favored in grievance studies, where a lot of people pull and say that it was Foucault or Derrida that was talking about these power structures. If you look at the modern representation, a lot of it is now more pulled from him. So Pierre is more important, I think, in his analysis of symbolic violence. But it's also a nonsense idea, because it assumes something about an agent in relation to an object or a subject. So it assumes that anything that can be used that symbolically segregates individuals is necessarily a dehumanizing function. And I don't know why that would ever be brought up. I don't think all functions of speech and all functions in the power dynamics necessarily move to, because this thing that I said necessarily means I dehumanize you, which then leads me to act out actual violence. There is a vast, like, logical conclusion that's not logical at all. So to me, that's just wild. That's nonsense. I think that there is a place for understanding this symbolic violence. I think there are ways we could use it to shape how we talk to one another and to understand better ways of communicating between cultures. But to just assume that any type of criticism laid at the feet of another culture necessarily means I'm dehumanizing and want to kill them, or justifies my actions in armed conflict. I don't buy that. I think it's ridiculous. And then he also hated capitalism. One of these days, I'll get into those criticisms, but they're basically the same from Gramsci, Horkheimer, Adorno, as well as holding on to more of the materialist position that Marx had. And that was kind of the reason why he wasn't from the Frankfurt School directly, and why he disagreed with Jean-Paul Sartre and some of the existentialists, because they had too many contradictions in their stuff in dealing with the subject to the objective barrier. Anyway, I hope you come across. I hope you have a higher level of language, higher level of knowledge in this subject, and I hope it goes a long way. Have a wonderful day.